These tradespeople. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call Holly Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, it's interesting, Mr. Speaker. I never imagined when I entered Parliament that I would be so engaged by an amendment bill dealing with the regulation of the plumbing, gas fitting and drainlaying industry. But I guess that's one of the strange and wonderful things about this place, is that you never know quite what direction you'll be taken in. And this has in fact been one of the more complex, more controversial, more challenging and more constitutionally interesting bills that I have worked on so far in my time in Parliament. And it's certainly the first time I've experienced a hung select committee, Mr. Speaker. So it's been a very interesting experience indeed. Now, when this bill was first mooted by the Minister and he wrote to parties seeking our support, the Green Party indicated that we could tentatively support the legislation because we, like the Minister and other parties in the House, recognise that there probably was a problem with the 2006 legislation, which, as has been demonstrated by a series of complaints to the Regulations Review Committee, to the Ombudsman, to the Auditor General, and then again to the Regulations Review Committee again, did not allow the Plumbers, Gasfitters and Drainlayers Board to collect the levies and fees as they had been doing from its members for the purposes of prosecuting unlicensed practitioners. And as the Minister's pointed out, it's clear, well, perhaps it's not clear, but there's some indication that it was the intent of Parliament in 2006, when enacting the legislation, that the Board should be able to prosecute unlicensed practitioners. And the Green Party agrees, in principle, this should be the case. The Board should be able to prosecute unlicensed practitioners, and indeed it's in the interests of many law-abiding plumbers and gas fitters that there is the capacity to prosecute unlicensed practitioners, because these so-called cowboys, to use the Minister's terminology, do give their industry a bad name, and there's something to be gained for those registered law-abiding plumbers, gas fitters and drainlayers to ensure that those who are not are being prosecuted and dealt with effectively. So the Green Party certainly could support legislation to make it clear that the Board has the lawful ability to collect levies and fees from its members for the purposes of discipline and prosecution of licensed and unlicensed practitioners in the future. That we could support, and that we have communicated to the Minister. Now, I know that there are many in the industry who have grievances with the Board and who wouldn't even support going that far, allowing the Board to collect these levies in the future. There is, as we've heard from previous speakers, a lot of bad blood in this industry, a lot of mistrust of the Board, which is unfortunate, but which is not unfounded, historically speaking, based on the actions of the Board over a number of years at certain times. However, I do believe that these grievances are largely historical, and they could be addressed, as the Honourable Ruth Dyson pointed out in her contribution last week in the second reading debate, if the Board showed a greater commitment and a greater degree of transparency about how it spends the offences fee, to reassure those with concerns that it is actually spent for the purpose for which it is collected on the prosecution of unlicensed practitioners. And as an advocate of transparency and open governance, I certainly did sympathise with submitters from the Federation who showed the committee the efforts that they have been to under the Official Information Act to obtain information from the Board about how the levies are spent. That they've had no end of difficulty in getting hold of that information, and long delays. And I think proactive disclosure from the Board would go a long way towards addressing some of these concerns. So, with that caveat that greater transparency on how the levies are spent is needed, the Green Party could, as I've said, support legislation which gave the Board the ability to collect offences fees in the future. Our concern with the amendment bill currently before the House is its retrospective nature. As a number of speakers have remarked, retrospective legislation is not something that this House should ever take lightly, and we're certainly not persuaded that it's justified in this case. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, whether they thought they were doing it legally or not, the Board has been charging illegal fees and levies for a number of years, and people have taken perfectly legitimate complaints about this to every available adjudicator. As I said before, the Regulations Review Committee, the Ombudsman, the Auditor General, and again this year to the Regulations Review Committee. And every one of those complaints has been upheld, Mr. Speaker, and at each stage those complainants have been vindicated that they have a legitimate complaint. So what message do we send in this House about natural justice and due process if at the end of all of those complaints and all of that process we say, yes, you're right, actually we've figured out it is illegal, so thanks for bringing that to our attention, we'll just change the law now, thank you very much. You can understand why the complainants are upset that this House is considering the retrospective validation of those illegal levies, Mr. Speaker. In fact, it reminds me of the legislation that the Prime Minister has signalled we should expect soon in this House about the GCSB to validate years of illegal spying on New Zealand citizens and permanent residents. Now, that's a higher profile example than the Plumbers, Gasfitters and Drainlayers Board, but the retrospective nature of this Plumbers, Gasfitters and Drainlayers Amendment Bill is no less distasteful than that example. The fact that people thought it was legal at the time is no excuse for illegal conduct. And people have taken legitimate complaints about the collection of this levy. And the solution, in the Green Party's view, is to change the legislation for the future, but not for the past. Now, we recognise that if we were to take this course of action, it might require the board to refund some or all of the fees and levies that it has collected since 2006. And that indeed was the recommendation of the complaint to the Ombudsman and the findings of that complaint. And we think it's probably fair enough that they do refund some of those levies and fees that they have collected illegally. However, as the Minister's pointed out, this could potentially put the board under some financial strain and possibly bankrupt it. Well, if this is the case, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister, what is so bad about going to the Minister of Finance and asking for some government support to allow the board to refund the illegal levies without going under? After all, it was a government error in the drafting of the original legislation that has allowed all of this to happen in the first place. Yes, admittedly, a different government, but the Crown is the Crown, and in this case, I think that there is a case for the Crown to take some responsibility and contribute some financial assistance if it's needed. Now, the best estimate that I could work out based on the information that was available to us as members of the Select Committee was this might mean a liability of something like $1 million. Now, I know $1 million is not an insignificant amount of money, to be sure, but it is certainly an amount that I think the Minister of Finance and the Crown is capable of finding in the budget, Mr. Speaker, and absorbing. So that is a solution that the Green Party could have supported, fixing the legislation going forward into the future, but allowing due process to take its course for the collection of the illegal levies and for the existing legitimate complaints. We do acknowledge that the industry needs a fix, but retrospective validation is not justifiable, and the rushed process at Select Committee, and yes, I acknowledge it was extended from 1 week to 3, but still that is an extremely short time, and there were a large number of people who wished to submit in person who did not have the opportunity to do so, has not helped. This is a divided, conflicted industry, and unfortunately it seems absolutely certain to remain so with the passage of this legislation. Mr. Speaker, the Green Party will continue to oppose this bill.
I call Kanwaljit Singh Bakshi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand to support the second.